Okay, I think we're live. Welcome everybody. So we're trying something new. I'm recording I'm recording, and you're gonna watch the recording. So it's kind of freaky, but thank you for coming in tonight. We're gonna talk about generational communication, and in the little tiny screen you see there is Carrie Mitchell. She is going to present to us tonight. She works with Moxie Solutions, and you're in Denver. Is that right, Carrie?
Yes.
So we're trying to get super creative to offer you some different trainings. So I'm just going to hand it over to you, Carrie, and I may interrupt you if we have some really good questions come in, but take it away.
Sure. All right, that sounds perfect. So to get started, as Kathy said, I'm going to talk a little bit about generational communication. In terms of my background, I've studied multiple generations. It's what I did my dissertation on when I got my PhD. And I also teach at University of Denver, and I teach all the way from undergrads who are like 18 or 19 up to, I think my oldest adult student on the adult side once was 81. So I've studied this, seen it in work, because I still obviously work with some organizations and seen it in teaching. So we're going to go through mostly how we think and how different generations are. Of course, please stop me if you have some questions. But to start with, I'm going to, you didn't know you had a quiz, but I'm going to give you a quiz here to start with. All right, so it's not coming in the way it's supposed to for me. Let's see. There, so we'll just go through one at a time here. So we're going to talk about what the me generation is here in just a minute. But we're going to look at some of these quotes and see if you can think about who may have said these. So for example, my workers asked to go to a concert and get the day off. I said no, and they went anyway. So if we were live, I normally ask people, if I'm in person, to raise their hand, give me an idea. And I get everything from the latest generation, Gen Z, to people saying baby boomers. And really, this came from someone who was talking about Gen X, but it could be any generation. So the next one here is lateness, absenteeism, and unwillingness to work overtime can be problems. And again, I usually have people say this is the youngest generation, whatever it is at the time. But this has been said from the youngest generation clear up against baby boomers. So I'm sure you can guess what the pattern is going to be here for some of the other ones. Okay. They only care about themselves. So that's something, again, we hear across all generations, but we tend to think it's, again, younger generations that only care about themselves and not others. And then they don't identify themselves by their jobs. Again, this could have been said about any generation, but we see this a lot right now. And sometimes we forget that when we were that age, we may have been the same way. So I usually start with some of these quotes to remind us that there are definitely some things that are generational, but there's also some things that just go with being a certain age when we may not have experience, we may not have lived in the world as long, and different things are important to us. So some things are definitely more age specific than I would say generation. And then we'll talk about the generational pieces as well. So again, I don't know if all of you know off the top of your head. I usually ask who knows. But the first generation called the me generation was actually the baby boomers. So they were called the me generation. Sort of skip Gen X for a little bit, and I'll show you what all these mean. And then with millennials, they became Generation Me, thinking they were focused on themselves. But again, it's really been around for anyone that's young and idealistic. Now I'm going to show you a few images like this. Hopefully you can see all these images. And what I would like you to do when you think about these is think about, one, of course, what you relate to. So hopefully you'll see some images and remember some things from the past. But also I want you to think, as we go through all these, what are the hidden messages that you might be getting from something as simple as how do you get to school, whether that is a bus or something like a Lyft or an Uber, or your parent drives you in a car where there's a movie playing. So I'm just going to go through a few of these and let you think about some of what may influence us. So with this particular slide, on the top, again, look at things like the dress and who those people are. So this is a slide from the 1950s with nurses, and you'll notice they were actually wearing dresses.
Carrie, we actually aren't seeing a slide with pictures.
I'm sorry?
We aren't seeing a slide with pictures.
You're not seeing the pictures. Okay.
Oh, there they are. Okay.
All right. So this was the first one that apparently you missed. Sorry about that. With the bus and lift. And then this is the next one. I'm not sure why it didn't come up. I apologize.
We got it now.
You got it. Okay, perfect. So if we think about things, though, for someone who may have been around, let's say, involved in nursing back in the 50s, the messages they're getting, if you think about it, is you have to come to work. Again, what are you wearing, who it is, things like that. We go up to today, where now there's things like we can wear scrubs, and we have both genders present. And then thinking about what it means by formality. What do we do when we're out, and how do we make a deal? It's gone from things like shaking hands to fist bumping, which is obviously going to be a lot more common right now. Okay, I don't know where that one went. It got blank. Sorry about that. So this slide, we want to think again, how would you find information? So there was a time when if you wanted to read a book, you actually had to go to the library and check it out and read it. And you had 3 weeks to read it, unless you had to renew it. Then we got into where you could buy books. And now, of course, it could be electronic where you want the book and it comes up instantly and you can read it, whichever size font, things like that you want. So if we think about, probably most of you have used a computer at some point, but I want you to think through just a little bit, what kind of computer did you use for your first computer? So today, a lot of our younger people have had laptops their entire lifetime. They don't know these big junky computers that some of us had to use. And even before that, they were even bigger. So how we're getting information and communicating that way. And then we also want to think about the messages we're getting from society. So another piece of that might have been our toys. So Legos were pretty popular. Some of these little figurines were as well, and then Barbies. And if we look in the 1970s, you can see most of them were male figures. Again, we saw some females who were nursing. And again, not much diversity in terms of ethnicity. But today you can see we have all kinds of different types of jobs and professions being represented by those toys, as well as different genders and ethnicities. And then the same thing with the Barbie, where if any of you played with Barbies when you were younger, you might have only had the one option of the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Barbie. But now today we have all kinds of Barbies ranging in diversity, clothes that they have, all kinds of different things. So much more diversity going on now. And then to go back to how we got information, so we said some of you might have had to check out a book from the library, but think about how you even found out the meaning of a word. So there was a time when we actually had to look it up in a dictionary. You had to have a dictionary or go check one out to look up a word, or an encyclopedia. So if you had those handy, you could look certain things up. But again, today we have Google and Wikipedia. And so everything you want is right there. We have dictionaries online. You can have it on your phone. You can have it on your computer. Spell check. So this is another interesting one that I like to see if people can relate to it when we're in person. So some of you will know what this is and some of you won't. But before we had computers, there was a time when we had to type using carbon copy paper. And that would mean you would type on this paper that had ink that would go onto the page behind it. So we didn't necessarily have copiers to use. So that's how we would do that. And if you made an error, you didn't want to start all over. So there's be times when you might use whiteout. Okay. Of course, today, you just have a new document. We already have autocorrect. Things come up and tell you what's happening and make changes so you don't have to worry about all these different copies and how to do it. And then thinking about how we got information. So again, how we get communicated to is going to impact how we communicate out to others. So one thing to think about is how we got information. So again, our oldest generation got a lot of one-way information from the radio or a newspaper, where then we moved into getting things on TV, which is still one way, to today we have a plethora of different news channels that often invite you to give your feedback, your comments, your multiple perspectives. And thinking about how we take pictures and communicate where we've been. Believe it or not, some people had to wait a long time to get their film developed before they could see images. Of course, today it's instantaneous. And in between, we had things like the Polaroid, where we would have pictures that would print out, but they weren't very high quality, or you had to wait sometimes a week to get your film developed. And then that turned into an hour. And then, of course, we have what you see today. So then when we look again how you might send information, it used to be in some ways that you might type a letter. You'd actually have to mail it. If it was going overseas, it could take weeks, and you had to pay all kinds of crazy postage. To today, where we have instantaneously, you can be on your phone and communicating with somebody halfway across the world. So thinking about that communication piece again, we think about the tools we used. There was a time when we had the rotary phones. There was a time when you actually had to pay to use what we called the pay phones, to today where you can actually talk as we are right now through our computer, or you might have multiple devices and phones. And last thing to think about just with some of these is, again, how we get information, how we share things, how we have videos. So it used to be, again, you take a video, if you could. Some generations couldn't. Other times you could. You'd have to put it in a big roll. Other times it went to video, like a VHS tape. Now, of course, today it's instantaneous. And video is so much of what we do with our lives. We have things from TikTok to YouTube, all kinds of things out there. So one thing to think about, and this is usually where if there's someone there and you can participate, Kathy, if you have any questions, feel free to do that. But think about what are some of the common themes you've seen across all of these images so far?
Well, somebody commented, and I feel with her, some of us feel old.
Yeah.
Carbon paper and dial-up phones, yeah.
Yeah, and that's just to show you that things just change very rapidly. So, yes.
It's very true.
Yes. So some of the things I want you to think about, again, is thinking about your time frame and your age group, is what was the speed that it took you to communicate or get information? And how did you get feedback? And was communication one way versus two way? And what was the interdependence piece? Who did you have to go to get different tools and things that you wanted? And then also our global reach. So obviously all of those things are going to change. And I don't want you to feel old, although I understand. I do some of that too when I look at these. But the idea is really more to think about how it changes the information. So there was a time when people could go, I have friends who went to Europe after high school, and they actually could not talk to their parents for like 2 weeks at a time. Whereas today people are so interconnected, we don't necessarily have that time when we can't be connected. And it does change how we communicate. So that's a long overview, but I'm hoping as we talk about some of these things, we'll be thinking about other people's point of views, what they've experienced, and then how we can use that to communicate effectively. Okay, so you've got a lot of the pieces out there from our influences already. But again, one thing I want to be clear on is that generation certainly has an impact. And we're going to be talking today, and so far we've been talking about the US, but it's definitely going to depend on your culture, your location, your family structure. So again, if you grew up with grandparents or other people in your home, you're going to be influenced by them. And of course, personality, we're all going to be a little bit different. And socioeconomic status is going to have an impact as well. So not everything is going to go to every generation. These are very big generalities. So I just want to make sure if not all of it resonates, again, understand there's multiple influences as well. So as our quick overview for who the different generations, we currently have 5 that are in the workforce at times. We have the silent generation, baby boomers, Generation X, millennials, and then what we're calling Gen Z. They also have other names. iGen, I've heard, Alpha generation. So there's different names out there, but Gen Z is the most popular. And we'll go through what all of these are here in just a minute. And another thing here to keep in mind is life stage. So as we talk about generations, it also impacts the life stage that we did certain things. So think about for a second what age you were if you've done any of these yet. Like how old you were when you entered the workforce, or if you got married, or if you had kids, or when you might have reached a stage of burnout. So for example, with me, most of my friends and I were working at 14 or 15 in various different things. I refereed soccer. I had other friends who had newspaper routes. My parents all lived on farms, and they were working from the time they were like 10. And some of today's generation does as well, but then we also have some who don't necessarily have their first full-time job or really working, until they graduate college, which means they're entering the workforce at 22, 23. So it used to be everyone sort of came in at the same time. Now we're seeing, again, a vast difference. So you might have a 20-year-old that you work with as a volunteer who's had 5 years work experience, or you might have one who that might be the first real type of experience they've had. So we don't want to make those assumptions at this point. We also used to have different ages for when we got married. So there was over like 50% of women were married by the time they were age 20 in the 50s and 60s. And now we're going up to the average age is going to be closer to 30. So certainly there's going to be some generational impacts on our life stage. And that is also going to impact how we communicate, because whether you're married and you have kids, you're single, what you want to do in life is going to impact how you communicate. So right now I'm giving you all the reasons why. Let's see, can you see this?
The video?
Yes.
Yes, we can see it. Can't hear it very well.
That's not. All right, so I'm not sure if you could hear that then, but part of you seeing this commercial is to show you again that impact. This came out a few years ago when Facebook was really popular, and someone would be talking about their photos on the wall, and this just to show you older generations actually took the pictures and put them physically on a wall. And even thinking about what we mean by some of those terms of friend or who would you give information to has changed quite a bit. So that was a quick commercial that hopefully you can relate to or you've seen it. So as we go through each of these generations, I know you're going to have both some people you work with, some volunteers, some parents that fit into various age groups. So that's one thing to think about, again, is how they communicated. So if we think about baby boomers, for example, they did a lot of teamwork, and they obviously created some great change. This is when we had the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, all kinds of great things happening. But a lot of that was done in groups in terms of protesting, things like that, where today we don't see that quite as much. One of our defining characteristics for Generation X is that we refer to them as the latchkey kids. So Generation X was the first generation where we saw both parents often working. They were the first ones to actually see a lot of divorce. So up to this point, divorce was not always well accepted in some aspects of society. But with Gen X, over 50% of their parents were divorced. So if their parents weren't divorced, they probably knew cousins, friends who were. And so that impact was then we had two working parents. So when it used to be some other generations, they'd come home and they'd have a parent at home to talk to and do certain things. Generation X was very much a lot on their alone. Sorry, I couldn't say that well. So if they had siblings or other friends in the neighborhood, you might communicate. Otherwise, they spent a lot more time by themselves. So a little bit more internal communication and less team communication. So with millennials, some of us think of them as the generation where everyone wins a trophy. And again, this is where we started thinking that self-esteem was really important for kids. So we started to try to think, and when I say we, I mean as a society, started taking away some things that would make some feel better or worse than others, and really worked on that self-esteem piece. Millennials also had a time when they were getting No Children Left Behind Act. So a lot of times in schools, they were getting taught to the test and not actually thinking through how to make solutions and how to figure some things out. And of course, that's not all millennials. It's going to be a very certain group. But again, I just want to give you some impact. Think about what has impacted this group. And then, of course, the youngest millennials are going to be ones who've had technology for a lot longer. The older end of the spectrum hasn't had it their whole lives, but they got it young enough that they probably feel comfortable using most technologies. And then where we're at today is we have Generation Z. This is the group who was born pretty much with the internet. A lot of them have used cell phones, smartphones, tablets almost from the time they were born. Might have been their babysitters at times. They often have multiple screens. They might have a TV on while they're on their laptop and their phone. So I'm not really sure anyone can exactly multitask, but Gen Z definitely tries and thinks they can do a little bit more. They've gotten into things like virtual reality. And so a lot more of what they do is going to be on their technological devices. So why I'm showing you some of this is I want you to think about the impact of the messages we're getting from society. So I want to show you some images here from television. I think this is only one source. So we don't have time to go through what you might be getting in terms of newspapers or movies, books, anything like that. I just want to show you some TV shows. And again, think about what the messages might be sending to that group. So if we go clear back to the 1950s and 60s, if any of you have seen I Love Lucy, you'll notice it was black and white, but we couldn't even show at this period men and women in the same bed. We wanted to avoid the sexual context altogether. So moving to the 70s, you start seeing more now because we have TV. You can actually see things like MASH, where there was a war. Where up to this point, I think a lot of people had seen some things on TV, but most of what you were getting could have also been on the radio or the newspaper. So it wasn't visual, it wasn't live. So this is the first time some viewers actually got to see some of these behind the scenes. And then, of course, we also started seeing more women at work. So this is when we started seeing women go into the workforce and seeing women's issues as well. In the 1980s and 90s, we definitely still have some family shows like Family Ties. But if you notice from the other ones, the focus is now turning on to friends. Who you're hanging out with at the bar, who you hang out with where you live, who your friends are. So that's going to be a little bit more of our focus. And then as we started the 2000s, we would see shows like Sex and the City. We'd see things like Transparent, which is about transgender individual. And you're seeing, of course, more reality TV. So if we go back and think that these are the messages you're getting, that's going to be quite different than the messages you're getting here. Okay? So I want to keep in mind how much of that impact our media is having. And then if we look at today, where we are in 2020, we have a lot more things that are streaming. So we have Netflix, we have Prime Video, we have Hulu, and we have Disney Plus, all kinds of things. And so one of that is not just that we're seeing more things and we're getting more diverse and we're seeing different people on TV, but also the speed. So if we go clear back again to when there was I Love Lucy, we had to wait sometimes for the next episode to come out. Sometimes then they would take all summer off and you'd have to wait for the fall when the shows came back on. Today, obviously, many of you probably binge watched. So there's not that point of where you have to wait a week or even a season. You just want to keep watching the next show and you get to go ahead and watch. So why I'm bringing up technology is I really want to focus on how sometimes we don't know how we're different. So to me, it's like a fish in water. The fish doesn't know he's in water, he or she's in water, because that's all that he knows. And so a lot of times that happens with technology too, where we don't realize what we know is different. So if we're so immersed in the technology, we may not realize that others don't have it or that they use it differently than we do. So we always want to think about that. I think about it with so many of us now, it's easy to turn on a light switch and your light goes on. But 100 years ago, some people didn't have that. They actually had to have candles. But we're so used to that. And so it's the same thing with technology. Some people are used to communicating that way. So I like to connect it with, if you crossed your arms, you can follow along with me if you want to, how that feels. And then if you put your other arm on top, how that feels. Most of you can do that. You can learn it. But over time, if I'm not reminding you, you're going to slip back to what was comfortable. And if you're good at doing it with your arms, you could do it with your hands, switching which one has the thumb on top, or even thinking about if you wrote your name with your right hand or your left hand, depending on which you're right-handed or left-handed, and trying that. It's certainly something we can learn, but it's never going to be as comfortable as what we're taught or what's most comfortable. So I like to think with generations, we can certainly help some learn technology or actually learn to communicate without technology. We can always learn, but it's not going to have that same comfort. Okay. So we want to think about that. It takes some time to learn it. So to give you an idea on the youngest generation, Gen Z watches a lot of video. So if you can see on here, they watch up to 68 videos in one day. And this can be from Snapchat, YouTube, Facebook, any of those things. And this infographic was created before TikTok. So if any of you know TikTok, the latest app, that's probably going to make our numbers go up even more. So that's how they're getting their information. So when we think about smartphones and who actually owns smartphones, 98% of Gen Z does, compared to 40% of baby boomers. Again, what that means is it's not as important to think about who has what. but how we're using it to communicate. So if one generation is so reliant on using a phone, that's how they communicate, another one's not, that's obviously going to create some issues. Because it's just a different way of communicating if we want to talk face to face or if we want to have that technology piece. So for another statistic on that, Gen Z says they're on their phone almost constantly at 45%. So again, this is something I've seen in the classroom where I ask the students to put their phones down and shut their laptops. And some of them really cannot do it for more than 5 minutes. Some of that's because they haven't been used to it. It's that whole arm thing where they haven't done it. And then studies are also showing that there is an addiction. So there is an addiction piece to that as well. And again, 73% of Gen Z will make purchases based on a social media recommendation. So that means that they're doing things like Yelp or getting input into how to make decisions, where at one time you were on the spot, you couldn't connect to anyone or anything, and you had to decide on your own. Now it's much more collaborative. We want to hear what everyone else has said and what they're doing. So just wanted to give you a background on why we communicate the way we do, because that might help you give perspective when you're talking to others, to think about what have their experiences and their viewpoints been. Because what we really want to try to do is not necessarily shame anybody or make stereotypes, but we want to understand why they communicate the way they do so we can find that commonality. So the key things I would say here is really to be understanding, accepting, and forgiving of others. So realize they may not communicate the same way you do, and some of that is going to be personality, of course, but some of it's the tools and things that have been available to them. And if you have grown up your whole life using a phone, that's going to look a little different than if you didn't get a phone until you were 40 and having to use that. So that's one thing, again, where we see the clash, is that it's just a different way of communicating. But we also want to make sure not to stereotype. Not everyone is the same. There's certainly people I've worked with who are grandparents, especially, who want to keep up with their kids and grandkids. And they are on social media all the time. They know it better than I do, and that's great. And there's certainly some younger generation whose parents didn't let them have full access, or maybe they were in an area that didn't have good Wi-Fi, something like that. So there are going to be different aspects to this as well. So we want to make sure we always keep that in mind. And so we want to, again, really be respectful. I come at this to show you the media part and where we're at, because again, I want to hopefully get across the idea that someone's not good or someone's not bad. It's just that we have different experiences, and that's coming to us from what we do at school, to what our parents tell us, to what we're getting in the media. All of those things are going to impact what we think is the right way to communicate. So again, understanding those differences is going to help us be respectful. So by that, I mean, don't attack, don't blame, don't assume one way is the right way. And if you're not sure what someone wants, it's always a good idea to ask. Don't make any assumptions. So again, I usually start off with, when I'm working with a new group, how do you like to communicate? I don't want to assume that they all want to text, because maybe they don't. Maybe they do want to talk face to face. So it's always a good idea to ask and have some of those questions ready to go, so you can figure out what would be work for your group. And again, I always think helping and mentoring. So the more we can teach someone or opposite side of you, or if any of you are in those middle generations, you can adapt a little bit easier to either side, but really understanding the importance of that, because technology can really save us some time. But then there's some things where we really need to talk face to face, like, for example, with conflict that just can't go through technology. So again, trying to help and mentor others, I think, is good. And you want to be patient. Remember, it takes time to learn new things. So again, make sure you're always explaining what the preference is, why, how to do certain things. Let's be helpful rather than judgmental. And then when you are working with different groups, if you're not sure what someone wants or what's expected, it's best to just set those expectations and guidelines. So anything from how do you address somebody. Some generations, it still needs to be Mr. or Mrs. Others want first names. And it's okay to set that expectation up front so everyone knows. And then, of course, try to give them the why. And then thinking about which hours people work, when they show up, how do they work, which technology do they use. So I have worked with organizations where they've had to say things like, when you're at work, your phone's off, you have to hide it. Other ones, they use text to communicate. So all of that's going to be up to you, but really making sure that's communicated will be helpful. So I know we went through a lot of information really quickly, but if you have time, are there any questions?
Well, first of all, good job, right at 30 minutes.
Yes, I try.
That was a lot of good information. And what I love the most, and I hope our foster parents hear, is to figure out how you like to communicate, and then your case manager, because we have the spectrum with our case managers and our foster parents of all the generations. So I think establishing the how is the best way to communicate with you for both parties is really important. We did ask that question, and we have a lot of people that say face-to-face, but they also understand that's not always convenient or, the best way. If somebody's sitting in a meeting, they can't meet you in the lobby every time you pop in.
Right.
So, I don't know that we have any real questions. We have lots of comments. People have, kiddos being addicted to their devices, the effects of social media. There's a lot of insight here. But I don't see any real questions.
Okay.
And if they come up with one, we can get a hold of you, Carrie. But thank you so much for your time, and this was really good stuff. I love learning about the different generational issues, and I feel like I should dye my hair gray tonight.
But unless you want to. And so I think it's great if you can share those comments for each other too, and share some of those experiences, because that does happen a lot. I see where one person does say, I think my child is addicted.
Yeah.
How do I stop that? Or what have you done? And I think really when you have the opportunity of sharing that information, that may be really helpful as well.
Absolutely, because a lot of kids are coming that way.
Yes.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you, Carrie. Thank you to everybody. And we,
right.
Carrie, if you'll just email me tomorrow, we'll tidy up things. And then for foster parents that are coming in later, you do just need to make a comment to get credit for watching this video. And thank you, Carrie.
All right. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.